thought it was kind of fit, and I thought, that's interesting.
Well, good morning. Shall we get started? Let's start with a prayer this morning. Loving God, we are grateful for the gift of life that you have given to us, the breath of spirit that you breathe so deeply within us, the spirit of inquiry that emanates from within us. We ask that you touch our minds with your wisdom and our hearts with your compassion as we seek to understand your word and guidance for us in our daily lives. Lead and guide us in our discussion this day. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Hi there, Pat.
I didn't eat that this morning, so I'm going to be good.
Well, I doubt that. Last Sunday, I said, in my opinion, that salvation is basically about faith and trust, and it's the confidence that we have or the faith that we have that God loves us. And Vaughn Pritchard and I had a discussion about that, and I thought that was really reinforced by the presentation from Tennyson Center when the fellow talked about what is it that gives the kids the security to change. It was that basic trust that they have in those who are working with them. It's that faith. It's that environment that really gives us a sense of security, well-being, and that's really what salvation is all about. Anyway, then this week, I really enjoy, so that's the right word, appreciate, there is a Roman Catholic priest by the name of Richard Rohr, who is a contemplative. I ran across him in Albuquerque when we were down there. He has a meditative center, and he writes a daily thought. And this week, one of his statements was about salvation, and he goes on to say, he says he's going to be he's going to say some heresy possibly for some folks. He says, salvation has little to do with belief systems, belonging to the right group, or correct ritual practice. It has everything to do with living right here, right now, and knowing, and he uses knowing in that trusting, faithful way, a beautiful and a fully accepting God is this very moment giving to you. All you can do is sit down at the banquet table and eat. If you can enjoy heaven now, you are totally prepared and ready for heaven later. Then he goes on and quotes another contemplative who talks about the aspect of art and sculpturing, that the sculpture really doesn't determine what's in the block of marble, but has a sense of chipping away what shouldn't be there and letting that image emerge out of it. And that's kind of what we're talking about in terms of our faith journey. Anyway, I made copies of it, so if you'd like to have a copy to read and to think about this week, take a copy.
Will there be a test later?
There'll be a test next week. You said you didn't eat that this morning.
I didn't.
Okay, let's just to review a little bit. Paul is writing to the churches, and as I said before, we don't know exactly the geographical area where these Galatians are, but we do know that they are ethnic Galatians, that there really isn't in this group many, probably any at this particular point, Jewish followers. Paul established the church. He left, and after he had left Galatia, Then there were some folks who came from, it appears, from James or from Jerusalem, and was contradicting some of what Paul had said, in that Paul is talking about the freedom of grace, of God's love. And they are saying, well, he didn't tell you the whole story. Before you become a Christian, you have to become a Jew, or you have to follow some of the Jewish practices. And that made Paul kind of livid. So he then is writing this letter to try to correct that misunderstanding. And so we're going to begin with verse 6. I stopped there last time because even though in many translations there are periods at the end of what would be sentences, in the Greek there is absolutely no period between verse 6 and at the end of verse 10. It is all one sentence. Chapter 2. So let's begin there. And take a look at what Paul has to say. I will read it all the way through, and then we'll come back and take a look at it individually. He is not only defending his statement about the grace of God and about the love of God, and that's what is important and significant, but he's also, it's important for him to justify his own authority and his own position in relationship to the whole church. So he's talking about this meeting that he had in Jerusalem, and then he goes on to say, let's start with 5. He did not submit to them even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel, the good news of God's grace, might remain with you. And from those who were supposed to be acknowledged leaders, Paul every once in a while, even though he is a very loving, accepting writer, there are times he gets like most of us. He has to put those little digs in. And so he gets one here. Later he'll talk about Gentile sinners. And from those who were supposed to be acknowledged leaders, what they actually were makes no difference to me. And then he kind of modifies that a little bit. Well, God shows no partiality. So God even accepts them even though he's not certain that they were actually leaders. Those leaders, and he wants the Galatians to hear this clearly, those leaders contributed nothing to him. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised. Herein lies part of the problem. I said I was going to read it all the way through, and you know me better than that. Here lies part of the problem. The early church, James and Cephas and John, were trying to figure out how do you adequately carry out a mission and to proclaim the gospel to two different groups of people, basically. One, the Jews, the other, the Gentiles. And as we all often do, they started out by making a very clear distinction between the two groups. Here are the Jews who have one history and practice that we need to address with regards to how this new gospel of Jesus Christ affects their spiritual lives. We always have to remember that people are rooted in a spiritual journey. And so they had been. And they had had this sense of security and trust and faith in the law. Okay, so that's not something we want to dismiss. I mean, that's something that's highly significant. And so when they are They have placed their trust and their faith in all aspects of the law, and then you come with a different message that appears not only to contradict the law, but to teach something entirely different that has a whole unique perspective. Remember the experience of Peter. You know, he was on the rooftop, he was hungry, he was praying, he had a revelation that came to him that everything is considered ritually clean. A radical transformation and revelation. But changed his life and changed his understanding of the gospel. Well, that transformation and that experience had not occurred for everyone, so Peter and James and John have to try to figure out how to communicate that vision to people who haven't had that vision and yet are searching for or are seeking or are looking for something uniquely different and deeper. Does that make sense? How do you communicate that to a people who have had a whole history of being rooted in one particular thought and experience, and it's different? So they said, okay, Peter, who is a Jew, who's had this experience, who was a follower of Jesus, has been called, he will take the message to the Jews. Okay? Paul, who a Jew, and I say that, with regards to all of his training and understanding and where he had come from, had had a different kind of experience in which, after having the experience on the road to Damascus, as we talked last week, he goes 3 years, and we don't know where all he went in that 3-year time, trying to figure this out, what this means, what this experience of Jesus having come to him in a revelation, him having been in Damascus, having been touched by Ananias, the scales fall from his eyes, he sees differently, and he is loved and accepted by the church. He goes off, he reflects on that, he comes back to Damascus. Okay, so he's had a different kind of revelation and experience, and he sees his mission then of taking this gospel of God's grace to the Gentiles. Yes?
Is there any proselytizing in the Jewish faith?
No.
That's what I thought.
So that's a new concept as well, because at this time you were either born a Jew or not, and that's there were probably, whenever you say some of these statements, you can't always say absolutely forever amen, because there's always the edges, there's always the gray areas, there's always somewhere where you'll see something different, and there probably were those who were not born Jews that had become Jews. And in the diaspora, or in the Greek world, there were what they called God-fearers. They were the diasporas where the Jews had been deported virtually out of their homeland, were in all of these various Greek cities, set up synagogues that weren't quite as defined as they are today or after the destruction of the temple. But anyway, set up the synagogues in which many of the Greeks appreciated the teaching of monotheism, one God, and the ethical aspects of Judaism. And so then they identified with the synagogues. Some of them probably became Jewish in practice. But there probably was not an intentionality about going out and proselytizing. But if they came in, of course, they were accepted, taught, Does that make sense? Does that get to your question?
But I was also thinking that if Peter was taken out into the Gentile world, would they really be accepted? I think the people would have resisted that becoming Jewish because probably they would not feel accepted.
Well, and that's part of the yes, Ray.
Left side,
Mm-hmm.
pretty consistent all the way down to this present day. The right side is splintered into jillions of different beliefs and regulations, evangelicals.
And I would argue that it's really in the middle where much of the splintering has taken place. Let me just because the problem that emerges in Galatia and in other places is really exemplified in the statement that's going to come later when we see Paul challenging Peter. He says, "You, a Jew, living like a Gentile," and yet that becomes the issue. How do you live and exist and teach in a community where both are present? See, it was very clear for Paul when he went to Galatia the first time, because he could teach this gospel of God's grace that was emanated from the cross, and there was no other baggage associated with that in the minds of the Gentiles, like there is in the minds of the Jews. Then, that's different than where does Paul confront Peter? Antioch. You know, in Antioch, well, let's just put names up here. Let's just Galatia. Let's go back and put Jerusalem. But when you get to Antioch, where a lot of this problem becomes visible and part of the daily fabric of life, you have both Jews and Gentiles living together. And for the Jewish community, it was absolutely heresy, blasphemy to, let's just take one example, to eat meat that had been sacrificed at the temple. Because in their mind, if I brought home a steak from the temple, and you are Jewish and you sit down and eat it, it's hard in your mind for you not to be saying to yourself, I am in fact affirming temple, the cult worship. Does that make sense?
No.
Okay.
Well, it doesn't to me.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I always appreciate your questions because how do I say that? Okay, here, let's take a look at that. Here is...
I think we can appreciate it for being black and white. As ludicrous as it is to us, Jews live by black and white.
I think that's absolutely right. Good. That's the context to put it in. It is absolutely either or.
But now, if you were a Jew and you ate this meat, what's the outcome?
You had then, in their mind, you had worshipped at the temple. You had done absolutely the same thing as I had, regardless of whether I had seen myself as worshiping at the table, because that's where basically meat was, a lot of it was cooked. They didn't have the grocery store. So you took your meat, you went to the temple, you offered it there as a sacrifice, it was on the grill, then you took it home and shared it.
I think what's confusing here is you're using the word temple. Does that mean the Jewish temple?
Oh, very good. Excellent. Hey! Okay, good. Let me be even more specific and try the cultic sacrifice. Does that help? And let's just take temple out of it. Okay. Because you're right, you had meat at both places. And the same kind of practice, to get to your point. Oftentimes the meat that was sacrificed at the temple, not so much in Jerusalem, but let's say at Shechem, which was another high place for Jews in that part of the world where you could go and offer a sacrifice. A lot of the meat, when it was sacrificed, went to the priests, to the Levites, and their family. But it was also possible for you to take some of it home and eat it, meat that had been sacrificed to the god. In fact, these tangents keep going. If you read the law of the tithe, it's virtually a barbecue. That's what it is. I mean, you take your meat, you take your grain, you take your beer, you take whatever it is, and you go and it's sacrificed. And if you read that, then you take, it's given back to you, and with your family and friends, you sit around and consume it. So, you had a picnic. So, over here, we have a very similar practice. And then the cultic ritual at the, whatever temple, how do I get that word out of my mouth? Whatever pagan center, and I'm going to use that word, and I don't want to use it so much negatively, it's just that's where they went. They did the same thing. They took meat, sacrificed it to the god or goddess, and then took it back home and served their friends. So the practice was very, very similar. Does that make sense? And so when I, as a Jewish person, saw you as a Gentile bringing meat from your cultic center and inviting me to sit down and eat, I was hearing that as the same way as if I, as a Jew, had brought meat from the sacrifice and had invited you to sit down and eat. You were partaking of my sacrifice, and I saw myself partaking of your sacrifice.
Well, it's sort of like transubstantiation.
Okay. How does this? Go ahead.
Well, because there's always been a great vote. For us, the communion emblems represent the body and blood of Christ. For Catholics, for example, it becomes the body and blood of Christ. And I know, if there's any holy blessed wine, the priest drinks it, which is why some young priest, made a whole bunch for the early service. But I can see that maybe they thought that there was some essence of the God that resided in the meat after it had been offered to that God. Quite possible.
Yeah, I see where you're going with that.
And that's what transubstantiation.
Yes, transubstantiation is where the emblems become the body. They have to ring the bell. They have to ring the bell. Yeah, well.
Yeah.
Yes, ring the bell.
Yeah. Let's, well, since we've gone there and we've got that question, let's just take a look at those three. Yeah, we'll take another little detour.
Sorry.
Yeah, one verse. Transubstantiation in the Roman Church virtually means what Marcia just said, is that in the experience of the Mass, that the bread and the wine literally becomes the body and the blood of Christ. Okay? Even though it appears to have properties of bread and wine, it has become body and wine. Okay? And that's one of the reasons that many priests today still will not serve non-Catholic, because if it does not mean that to you, then that is blasphemy. So that, I've had priests who will serve me, some who absolutely refuse that. And I can understand that. I mean, just as I can understand this, I can understand that. Now then, Luther as they were processing that, came up with consubstantiation. Con with, okay? Which virtually means it has both properties. Is that it fully retains the properties of bread and wine, and at the same time the properties of blood and flesh. Then disciples come along and we say, it's there in your thought and faith and memory, is that these no longer actually, the bread and the wine are no longer in our thinking actual blood and flesh. They are symbols that point to the event of crucifixion and resurrection. Okay? So you see where the difference is?
Is that why I've read people about Christian?
That's absolutely right. Because that's where it comes. No, that's absolutely where that comes from, is from the teaching that it is literally the body and blood of Christ. So when you have people, I don't want to do that. That's really going to confuse things. When you have people who have had cannibalism in their history, and you as a missionary come among them, and you start talking about the body and blood of Christ, they know exactly what you're talking about. We just had Sam last night for dinner. And now we're at church having Jesus. Well, so, and when you are dealing with literal thinkers, see, I mean, it's easy to see how that progressed. Sam last night, Jesus today. So, and then if you don't want your family or your clan to become Christian, and you have some resistance to cannibalism, you say, well, those Christians, all they are cannibals. See where that unfolds? So it was a real problem. I mean, it is a real problem. And it's not just something that was manufactured. It came out of theology. And I think that's where we always have to realize that any statement any of us make can be read one way or another. I mean, a good example this morning, my saying temple. You know, I'm thinking cult. You're thinking Jerusalem. And we weren't anywhere close. Okay? So, you know, that's probably one of the important things in all biblical thinking and study, is to realize that any statement we make can be looked at a couple of different ways. And that was the issue here, is that Paul understood the good news of Jesus Christ in a completely distinctive way from his Jewish background. Okay? He literally understood. Okay, let's go with the term justification or rectification before God. He really understood that his connection with God was, as we have talked about, through faith. And even though faith is a part of this journey, the Jews basically, concretely saw their rectification through God through behavior. You know?
They didn't accept Christ.
They accepted the law. Yeah, that's true. It was the law that saved. It was the law who taught them ethical values. It was the law that taught them how to behave. It was the law that taught them how to approach the temple. Well, actually, and we're going to get to this. This is interesting. Actually, Paul makes a distinction between the God of Abraham and the God of Moses. I mean, it's the same God, but, the law doesn't come until Moses. If we really look at, and what I'm really getting ahead of myself, we're going to get more verses than you think, but we're going to come back. When Paul gets into this argument, what he is virtually saying is that the law came 450 years after the promise. And what he is saying is that Abraham responded to the promise of God in faith. Abraham trusted God, left home, went into, this whole symbolic language was very literal language. He left home, went into a land I will show you. If that's not faith, what is? And then all during that journey, there are times of faith. Abraham runs into problems down in Egypt. So what does he do? He takes matters into his own hands and he says to his wife, "Tell him you're my sister." I'm not certain I really trust God here. It was really kind of nice back there, on all this journey, but now, see the swords? Tell him you're my sister. And it's the Pharaoh who has to correct Abraham and say, "Why didn't you say it was your wife?" Pardon?
I would have understood that.
I would have got it. And then when they don't have any children, and he and Sarai, at that time it's Abram and Sarai, it becomes Abraham and Sarah later, but anyway, then Abram decides to take matters again into his own hands. And he said, and of course, according to Mesopotamian law, it works. He says, don't have any offspring. God promised that the promise would be to the offspring. I'll just take Eleazar, my foreman, as my son, which according to Mesopotamian law was acceptable. He could do that. He could say, "That's my son." And God said, no, that's not what I had in mind. And so then Abram says, "Oh, my son." So then he takes his handmaiden, or Sarah gives the handmaiden to him, and they have this Hagar, and they have a son. And God says, no, that's not what I had in mind either. And finally then Isaac is born. But this whole episodic journey of Abraham is a struggle of faith. It's not a struggle of law. Does that make sense? Absolutely. So it's not until Moses who comes along and they're out in the desert and they have no discipline. This is the part that Paul is going to argue, is that there is no discipline because the discipline of community had been imposed in Egypt by the Egyptians. This is how you will behave. This is what you will do and will not do. So there was no problem. They get out into the desert and they have no discipline. They have no way of behaving towards one another, towards God. Some of them are wanting to go back to the flesh pot. Some of them want to go on to the promised land. Some of them don't know what they want. Thus the Ten Commandments. And Paul understands the Ten Commandments as providing the framework of life for us when we had no framework. What had happened with that, it had become interpreted as the way to connect with God, because God had given that to us, had given us this framework of how to behave, how to live, our identity. And so then we have to follow them to the letter, or God will not love us. Do you see how that progressed? And Jesus comes now, and one of the things, maybe you're going there. What did Jesus say?
Love thy neighbor, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart.
To do away with the law, but to
Fulfill the law. Yes, he says, I came not to do away with the law. And he said something else. He says, the yoke is heavy. I have come to free you. Meaning that all of this law that had not only from the Ten Commandments, but then had this whole body of interpretation through the Mishnah. Like I had said, it's not in the Ten Commandments that how you should wash your hands. But it becomes part of the teachings, because if you're going to honor God and you have a question about, well, how do I best honor God with my hand washing? Well, here's the way. And if you don't wash them this way and let the water run down off your arms this way, you contaminate your hands and you're touching the meat, and oh my gosh, the whole world's coming to an end.
You really see, when you think of that total legalism, why the circumcision and uncircumcision became such a crazy stumbling block.
Absolutely, yes. And you know, the thing we don't want to dismiss is that we have to try to see how Paul and Peter and James was trying to get through that stumbling block. And Paul takes it right on. He says, you don't have to do that anymore. James probably is not quite as comfortable with that. Because he's still saying, you know, I'm a Jew, I trust God's love, but I'm still going to hedge the bet. You know, I'm still going to do, these practices are still important for me. And we can understand that.
Well, there's no, at least I don't understand that James really followed Jesus till after he was gone.
And we don't know that. We really don't know at what point James, and from everything that we really read between the lines, James is the power in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, Paul talks, every time he enumerates, James is first. And so, you're right.
Because he's the brother.
He's the brother, that's right. You know, you take a look today, what is the big problem in the Muslim world between the Shia and the Sunni? It was who had the right to follow in the power of Muhammad. Was it his family, or was it some of his followers? That's right.
Question.
Yes.
Did Muhammad justify that Islam was sin?
You know, that's a good question. I would hesitate to answer that without going back and doing a lot of reading again, whether he actually said that or whether that's implied.
There was a nation created, 12 tribes, did develop into something or other. It wasn't Islamite, but hence they worship God, we worship God, and the God of Abraham is the only God.
That's right. See, the first part of the discussion or the argument,
Why do they fight all the time, though?
well, why do we fight with Baptists?
We don't anymore.
Well, we don't anymore, but, you know, I mean, well, some still do.
Education is the answer.
I think that would be a couple years study, but no, I think you're raising, I think the core question that you're asking is, if we believe in monotheism, then Christians, Muslims, and Jews are in the same family.
Right. Yeah.
We are Abrahamic. And we are Yahwistic, period. Now, how that gets interpreted is the issue. You know, how we've come with these different strands of interpretation of how God behaves in our lives, then that's different.
I can imagine God looking down and
You know, I often think about an illustration. One night when I was youth minister in California, and I hadn't prepared very well for the youth group, and of course this was back in the 60s, and so walked in and we're sitting around talking, and I went over and I got the globe. There was a globe in a stand over there, and I got it, and I set it in front of the kids, and I said, "Okay, let's just pretend. Let's just kind of think that if you're God, how would you address what's going on in our world today?" And I'll never forget Robbie McClure, 6'2", just lanky kid. I mean, very thoughtful kid, but he never had I don't think, a serious moment in his life. You know, he was just one of these kids. Everything was just funny, and he could get everybody. But anyway, he went over, he picked up the globe, put it under his arm, and he's kind of loving the globe, you know, and walking around. Then he goes over and he gets an eraser, and he just starts erasing. You know, and I have thought about that a million times. I can only imagine that there's sometimes God would just like to get their eraser and just start over. How? Well, that's right.
Flooded the earth and started over.
Where are we?
We're still on verse 6.
Still on verse 6.
Oh, no, you pretty well did 15 through 20.
I did 15 through 20. We just got to go back to 6. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel of the uncircumcised, meaning that that's a loaded word, meaning you did not have to be circumcised to be loved by God. You did not have to follow the law. God loved you first, and he responded to that love in faith and trust. Salvation. Okay? So that's a loaded image. On the contrary, when they... where am I? Just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised. See, they set this up, and later it's going to cause the problem. Paul, to the uncircumcised, carry the gospel of faith and trust. Peter, to the circumcised, to try to help them understand the gospel of faith and trust, which is a different approach. Okay? The gospel for the circumcised, for those who work through Peter, making him an apostle to the circumcised, also work through me and sending me to the Gentiles. And when James, again, James is mentioned first, so the assumption is in my mind anyway, James is the leader. Cephas, who becomes an emissary, a missionary, and we don't know about John, although there is tradition that John eventually went into India and carried the gospel into India. Who were acknowledged pillars, they were the acknowledged pillars of the faith, recognized the grace that had been given to me. That's just not any empty word. The grace that had been given to me. And they gave to, this is loaded, folks. And they gave to Barnabas, who is a Jew, who has become a Christian, and to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship, of koinonia. Okay, that doesn't mean they just walked up and said, "Well, Kathy, I hope you have a good day. On your way." When we talk about the symbolic act of koinonia, I am recognizing you as an equal. We are colleagues. We are the equal in the community. And so this term that Paul uses here means that when they did not, let me tell you what that does not mean. Because he wants to emphasize to the churches in Galatia, I was not commissioned by the mother church. They didn't lay hands on me, which is a different symbolic statement. Okay? They didn't lay hands on me, which we understand and which also occurred back before Paul and this, within Judaism. Laying on of hands was also a part of this, the Spirit, and also part of commissioning. So Paul is being very clear. We were not commissioned by the church in Jerusalem, meaning that we have our own authority. Okay? We were not commissioned by the church in Jerusalem to go out. We were recognized as equals. I know you want to write something down, but here, you don't have a pencil. Does that make sense? So this is a powerful statement here that we were given the right hand of fellowship, and there is no requirements other than a request. We weren't required to go circumcise all of you Gentiles. Okay? That's very clear here. So we should go to the Gentiles, they to the circumcised. They asked, not demanded, not required. The term is very clear. They ask only one thing, that we remember the poor.
They being who?
The church in Jerusalem, James and John and Cephas. Which was actually what I was eager to do, because Paul has this sense of mission about him, about caring for others. This was not a problem. And the reason for that is that the Christians in Jerusalem were made poor or poorer. Why? Because they were Christian. And they were cut off from their families. I mean, we talk about the struggles and difficulties of what it means to be a Christian. We have no idea. Because in the early day, and still in parts of the world today, to be a Christian is a very difficult, challenging life. But in Jerusalem, it was particularly challenging, because if you virtually said, I am a Christian, I am a follower of Christ, many families, as happens today, when you disagree with the family, they kick you out. James and Cephas and Peter and the apostles have a problem of trying to care for Christians. That's where the whole diaconate emerges. I'm on another tangent, I know, but that's where the whole diaconate emerges, is how do you serve and care for people who are cut off from their family, cut off from the temple, cut off. Okay. And Paul recognizes that, and he understands that, and he had no problem with that. In fact, he saw as part of the mission, which is interesting, part of the mission of the Gentiles to care for the Christians in Jerusalem. And probably more so than just Jerusalem, probably the whole Palestinian area. But Jerusalem was the symbol. Now we get to what we talked about for 2 hours already. Now we get to the argument that Paul places before the Galatians. He wants them to know that how and what is underneath what he is saying to them. When Cephas came to Antioch, he's saying, folks, I was in Antioch, and I had developed a church there. We had a group of people who were both Gentile and Jews, and we were Christian. Okay, we were following, they didn't call themselves Christian yet, probably. We were following the way of Christ. And Peter came to Antioch, and I opposed him to his face. Meaning, I didn't just snidely say things about what he was saying and doing behind his back. I walked right up to him and looked him in the eye and said, Peter, you're wrong. Because he stood self-condemned. I didn't have to condemn him. In Paul's mind, Peter stood self-condemned. Why? Because, let me give you the scene, he says. Before certain people came from James, again we get James, so we get this idea of who really was the power in Jerusalem. Before certain people came from James, he used to eat with Gentiles. Back to here. He came from James, and he'd sit down and he ate with Gentiles. He liked them steaks. Man, he did like them steaks. They were good. But after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. There were those who came from James who were saying, this is all well and good, folks, but before you really become a Christian or a follower of Christ, you have to be circumcised. Sorry, that's it. And the reason, for that is laid upon the males is because women at that particular point didn't have a whole lot of standing in the Jewish community. Not so in the Gentile community, because we know that there's a lot of Gentile women who are recognized as leaders in the church. That's where Paul gets a bad rap. But anyway, it's the circumcision because that's the law. That's the law. So you got to follow the law. And Paul had already gone beyond that. And the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy so that even Barnabas was confused. Even Barnabas, who received the right hand of koinonia, recognized as an equal, in Jerusalem, now it's different, and he's confused about all of this. And that hacks Paul off. And when he gets hacked off, you really don't want to be around him. He just is, he's very focused. Let's just put it that way. So here we have the essence of this conflict, is that when they come from James, he drew back and kept himself separate for the fear of circumcision. And see, that's where we get here into this problem. How do you actually minister in a community that has both? How do you talk to these folks and say circumcision isn't as important as you think it is? At the same time, you say to these folks, even though they're telling you you have to, you don't. I mean, it's a difficult journey. Does that make sense? Okay, so when I saw that they were not acting, the behavior, consistently with the faith, or the truth of the gospel, which is for Paul, faith, I said to Cephas before them all, we all remembered 2 weeks ago when you as a Jew came and lived like a Gentile, meaning you ate the barbecue. So you lived like a Gentile, not like a Jew. How can you compel Gentiles to live like Jews? And that, I think, is the essence of part of the struggle that we still have today, is that within the legalism that has emerged in much of the church, is how do you address that in a loving and a caring way and say you can't have it both ways. You can't say that the law, what you believe about certain things, is more important than your faith in Jesus Christ, in God's love for you. Do you see what I'm saying? Does that make sense? It's, let's just go back to one of the big issues that's hounding education today, creationists. Why not? Let's look it right in the eye. It's 10:30. You know, there are those who say if you do not believe this, you're cut off from God.
Sounds like a powwow between two Indian tribes.
Oftentimes, many times they had more peace than, particularly if they're in the Garden of the Gods, because before they entered the Garden of the Gods, they had to lay down their weapons of war. We need to find the Garden of the Gods for all of, but you know, that's similar to what's going on, is if you do not believe this, you are cut off from God. And it's important to them. I mean, we got to recognize that. There are others who are non-creationists who are saying that has nothing to do with our relationship to God, what we believe about this. What has to do with our relationship to God is our faith in God's love. That is precisely what Paul is saying here. It's not about whether you believe the law, it's whether you trust God's love. Does that make sense? And for all of those questions, we'll start next Sunday.
Actually, we can't because next Sunday is the kickoff Sunday, and we're going to have like everybody together during the kickoff.
Oh, just for part of it.
Or just for part of it.
And that reminds me, I got to write a statement about